You are tuned into Hip Hop Justice on Party 93.4 and 94.9 FM in the Hudson Valley, New York. What's up, y'all? You are tuned in here with Stevie Styles.
What did you say your name was? What did you say your name was?
Stevie Styles.
This is Party 93.4, your commercial-free station.
There are two types of incarceration. One type is what we call state-imposed sanctions. And state-imposed sanctions are simply criminal justice interventions. When someone has committed a crime, there is an intervention on the part of the criminal justice system, law enforcement. A person is put on trial, either convicted or released, and thus we have that state-imposed sanction. You go to jail or you go to prison. The second type of incarceration that we talk about is called self-imposed limitations. It's much more subtle, but it's much more pervasive. A self-imposed limitation, an example of it would be, I think that the only reason I'm in prison is because I'm African American. That if a white person would have committed the same offense, they would not have gone to prison for it. When there's objective evidence that not only are whites going to jail for the same crime I committed, but they're going to jail for much less offenses than the one I committed. So it doesn't hold up. It doesn't hold up to the microscope of reality. And so another example would be, I walk into a room of a self-imposed limitation. I walk into a room and for no other reason than the color of a person's skin, I dislike them. I don't know anything about them. I've never met them. I don't know their story. I don't know their history. I don't know their historic pain. But I simply dislike them and think that they're privileged or feel that they're superior to me for no other reason than the color of their skin. We call that a self-imposed limitation because it diminishes our capacity to be well. When you go in and think the worst of people, when you meet people and think the worst of them without even knowing them. And even if you do know them, to think the worst of them is still a self-imposed limitation because you don't know their potential. And so this ideal of a self-imposed limitation is very important to understand as we think about how we will change recidivism, which is the original question. How do we impact recidivism? Well, you have to begin to empower people to think differently, equip people to think differently about their own efficacy, their own power to act in ways that are outside their conditions and their conditioning. And by that I mean, you will hear people in prison say, well, you know, my father was missing in action. I know my dad was never there. My mother was strung out on crack, and my father sold drugs, and he was in prison. And increasingly, you hear that story more and more. It's so common that we actually come to think that about the majority of people who are in prison, that's why they're there. What I would say is, while all those things may or may not be true, and very often are true, those things do not necessarily equal crime. They don't necessarily equal a person choosing to commit a crime that lands them in prison. And I say choose because we cannot have this discussion without understanding the power that people have to choose how they will respond to their conditions. And so in the psychology of incarceration, we are always asking people to respond to the conditions that have shaped their lives, but to respond in a way that transcends the conditions. And that's where the work of Viktor Frankl, in his seminal writing, Man's Search for Meaning, begins to take shape. Because Frankl, in the midst of a Holocaust experience, imprisonment, they called themselves prisoners. They were clear, they were prisoners in concentration camps, facing genocide, a far cry more serious than most of us, even with life sentences in prison here. So Frankl makes the argument that it's our responsibility to make meaning, to find meaning in our suffering. And so through his ability to remember his love for his wife, he was able to find his way through this horrific experience. And he basically talks about for the person who comes out of prison, 3 caveats, which in this instance I refer to as 3 warnings that we should be mindful of if we're really going to change the dynamics of recidivism. He talks about one of them is moral deformity. Something happens in the course of this experience where our sense of morality becomes deformed in the course of our experience in this prison sentence. He then also talks about bitterness, how there is this need to recognize that there is a very high likelihood that when one returns to the community, you will find people who don't really care, or who may not be as concerned as you imagine they would be, and who will tell you, in fact, they've suffered too. And so they're not prepared to hear you talk about how much you've suffered in prison, and it leads to a kind of bitterness. And the third caveat he talks about is disillusionment, having to do with returning to society, to the life you've dreamed would be so different, and finding out that it's many times worse than when you left it. Finding out that it's not what you imagined, that freedom is not free, that yes, you're released, but your release has not led to your freedom.
Party 93.4.
Guess what? We'll be right back with lots more laughter and jokes.